You know that feeling when you walk onto your own property and something just feels wrong. Not like a small thing. Not like someone moved your trash can 2 feet to the left. I mean the kind of wrong where your brain freezes for a second because it's trying to process something that absolutely should not be happening. That's the moment I had one Saturday morning when I pulled into my driveway. Groceries in the back seat. Radio still playing. Perfectly normal day. Until I looked out toward my backyard and saw a man hammering boards into a brand new wooden fence. Now here's the thing. That man wasn't a contractor I hired. It wasn't a city crew. It wasn't a landscaper. It was my new neighbor, a guy named Rick Dawson, shirtless, sunglasses on, swinging a hammer like he was building the Great Wall of Texas. Except the wall was very clearly sitting inside my yard. And I don't mean near the property line. I mean inside my yard. About 2 feet inside, actually. I stood there for a second holding a bag of groceries, just staring. My brain was doing that slow calculation thing like, maybe I'm misunderstanding something. Maybe they're fixing a broken fence panel. Maybe they're replacing the old boundary line. Maybe. Then Rick looked up at me, wiped sweat off his forehead, gave me this little half smirk, and went right back to hammering like nothing was wrong. That's when I knew this wasn't confusion. This was intentional. Now before we get deeper into this mess, you gotta understand something about my place. I've lived there almost 15 years. Bought the house when I was younger, fixed it up piece by piece, planted trees, rebuilt the shed, leveled the backyard myself one summer with a shovel and way too much free time. My backyard became my little escape. Trimmed grass, an old red tool shed, and this massive oak tree that must have been there before the neighborhood even existed. In the summer afternoons, I'd sit out there with a cold drink and just listen to the wind in the branches, quiet, peaceful, exactly the kind of place you want after a long work week. For 14 of those 15 years, my neighbors were great. The kind of people who wave when they see you, borrow a ladder, maybe bring over leftover barbecue. Nothing dramatic, just normal suburban life. Then Rick moved in. Rick bought the house next door about 6 months before this whole situation. Big truck, loud exhaust, the type of guy who always seemed like he was performing for an invisible audience. The first week he moved in, he came over with a handshake and that big salesman smile. "Name's Rick," he said. "Looks like we're gonna be neighbors." We chatted for a few minutes. Normal stuff. "Where you from? What do you do? How long you lived here?" I told him about the yard, the old oak tree, the property line that runs along the old survey markers. Everything seemed fine, friendly even. But over the next few months, little things started happening. Rick kept making comments about my yard. "Man, you've got a lot of land back there," he'd say. Or, "Funny how the fence line sits so far over on your side." At first I didn't think much of it. Some people just talk like that. But after hearing it for the 5th or 6th time, you start to notice the pattern. It's like he was measuring the space with his eyes every time he walked outside. Still, I ignored it. Until that Saturday morning. So I walked across the grass toward him, grocery bags still in my hands, and I said, as calmly as possible, "Hey Rick, I think there's been a mistake. That fence you're putting up, it's on my property." He didn't even stop hammering at first. Just finished driving the nail into the board, stood up slowly, and turned to look at me. Then he laughed. Not a friendly laugh. The kind of laugh that says I know something you don't. "No mistake," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Those old survey markers are wrong. This strip's always been part of my yard." I blinked at him, because what he just said made absolutely no sense. When I bought the house, the bank required a full survey. I had the map. I had the legal documents. The property pins were still in the ground. This wasn't some gray area boundary situation. This was crystal clear. I tried again. "Rick, I've got the original survey. That line is 2 feet over from where you're building." He shrugged. "You might want to check again." Then he added the line that basically lit the fuse on the whole situation. "If you think I'm wrong, take me to court." He said it so casually too, like he was daring me. Like he already knew I wouldn't bother. And here's the thing about people like Rick. They operate on a very simple assumption. Most people don't want the hassle. Most people don't want the paperwork, the time, the stress. So they push a little, take a little, expand their space inch by inch because nobody wants to start a legal fight over a couple feet of dirt. Rick clearly thought I was that kind of neighbor. The quiet one. The guy who'd shrug and say whatever. But what he didn't realize was that I'm the kind of guy who keeps every document, every closing paper, every survey map. Every county record in a folder in my office labeled property. And if someone tells me to take them to court, well, I tend to take that suggestion seriously. So the next morning, while Rick was probably sipping coffee feeling pretty proud of his new, expanded backyard, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of legal documents, a highlighter, and a phone number for a licensed land surveyor. Because if Rick wanted to turn this into a game of territory, I was about to bring facts to the table. And facts have a funny way of ruining someone's little land grab fantasy. All right, let me pause the story for a second here, because what Rick pulled that morning is actually way more common than people think. And if you own property in the US, understanding this part might save you a massive headache someday. So here's the deal. From a legal perspective, land disputes between neighbors usually fall into one of three categories: honest mistake, boundary confusion, or what's called encroachment. What Rick was doing, that was the third one. Encroachment basically means someone builds something, a fence, a shed, sometimes even part of a house, over the legal boundary line onto someone else's land. Sometimes it happens by accident because an old fence was placed wrong decades ago. But other times, people do it intentionally because they think no one will challenge it. And here's where things get interesting. According to standard procedure, the moment a boundary dispute shows up, the only thing that really matters is a licensed survey. Not what a neighbor remembers. Not where a fence used to sit. Not where someone thinks the line should be. The survey is the physical translation of the legal property description recorded by the county. And that's the document courts trust. But there's another layer to this situation that people rarely talk about: the psychology behind it. This is a psychological trap a lot of aggressive neighbors rely on. They create a situation that feels too small to fight over, but too annoying to ignore. 2 feet of land doesn't sound dramatic, right? Most people hear that and think, is it really worth the trouble? That hesitation is exactly what people like Rick count on. Because if the fence stays there long enough, in some states it can actually strengthen their claim through something called adverse possession. Basically, if someone occupies land openly for years without being challenged, they can sometimes gain legal rights to it. So when Rick told me, take me to court, he wasn't just being cocky. He was betting on something. He was betting I wouldn't bother. And honestly, if I hadn't known how these disputes usually play out, he might have been right. But the moment I saw that fence going up inside my yard, I knew one thing for sure. If I didn't shut it down immediately, that 2-foot strip of grass could slowly turn into Rick's property. And that's exactly why I called the surveyor the very next morning. Because once the official markers hit the ground, the game changes. So the surveyor showed up the following Thursday morning, big white truck, orange tripod, the whole professional setup that basically screams this is about to get official. His name was Calvin Mercer, older guy, sun-beaten face, the kind of man who looks like he's measured half the land in the state. He shook my hand, looked over the paperwork I had spread out on the hood of my car, nodded once and said, "All right, let's see where the truth actually sits." Now, if you've never watched a survey happen, it's strangely intense. There's no shouting, no drama, just quiet precision. Calvin walked the yard slowly, checking the original county coordinates, pulling measurements, placing markers in the dirt with this calm, methodical focus. Meanwhile, Rick was outside pretending to wash his truck, but you could tell he was watching every step. And the thing about people who bluff is they get real quiet when evidence starts showing up. Calvin worked for about 2 hours. He double-checked everything twice, which apparently is standard practice. Then he walked over to me holding a bright orange flag marker. He stuck it firmly into the ground about 2 feet inside Rick's new fence line. Then he placed another one, and another, creating a straight line cutting directly through Rick's shiny brand-new fence posts. He stepped back, wiped his hands, and said the sentence that basically detonated Rick's little land grab fantasy. Well, there it is. That fence is about 2 feet inside your property. Not close. Not maybe. 2 feet. Clear as daylight. Rick heard it too. You could see his shoulders tense from across the yard. He walked over slowly, trying to look confident, but the swagger from a week earlier was definitely fading. "What's all this?" he asked, pointing at the flags. Calvin didn't even look bothered. "Official survey markers," he said. "Based on county records. The property line runs right here." Rick squinted down the line of flags, which unfortunately for him ran straight through his fence posts like a neon arrow pointing to his mistake. He tried one last push. "Those old records are wrong," he said. Calvin chuckled a little under his breath, not rude, just the kind of chuckle that comes from someone who's heard that argument 100 times. County records, legal deed description, and the original subdivision survey all match, he said. Lines don't get clearer than that. Rick didn't have a comeback for that one. But here's where things took a turn. Instead of admitting the obvious, Rick doubled down. He crossed his arms, stared at the flags, then looked at me and said, "Well, I'm not tearing it down." Just like that. No hesitation. No apology. Just stubborn pride standing in the middle of my yard. Now at this point I could have screamed, argued, maybe threatened him. But honestly I didn't feel angry anymore. Because the moment the survey finished, the argument stopped being personal. Now it was paperwork. And paperwork is a language the county government understands very well. So the next Monday morning I took Calvin's official survey report, along with my property documents, and drove down to the county land office. If you've ever been inside one of those buildings, you know the vibe: fluorescent lights, stacks of records, people quietly waiting their turn while clerks shuffle files behind the counter. It's not dramatic, but the decisions made there can change someone's entire week. I filed a formal encroachment complaint. Within days, a hearing date was scheduled, and that's how Rick Dawson ended up walking into the county office 2 weeks later looking like he was heading to a poker game he already thought he'd won. He walked in wearing boots, sunglasses pushed up on his head, big confident grin, the exact same energy he had when he told me to take him to court. I almost admired the commitment. We sat across from each other in a small hearing room. At the front of the table sat Commissioner Elaine Porter, a woman who had probably handled more property disputes than either of us could imagine. She opened the folder, looked at the documents, then looked at Rick. "Mr. Dawson," she said calmly, "you constructed a fence on property that does not belong to you." Rick leaned forward. "That survey is wrong." She slid Calvin's report across the table. "This is a licensed surveyor's report based on county records," she said. "Do you have conflicting documentation?" Rick opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because of course he didn't. There was nothing to show, just confidence and a hammer. Commissioner Porter folded her hands and looked him directly in the eye. "You are currently in violation of county property code due to encroachment." The room got very quiet. Then she delivered the part that completely wiped the smug expression off Rick's face. "You are legally required to remove the fence and restore the boundary within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in daily fines." Rick blinked. "Fines? Yes," she said calmly. "Per day." Now here's the funny thing about people who start fights over land. They rarely calculate the full cost of being wrong. Rick had already spent thousands installing that fence. Now he had 30 days to pay someone to tear the entire thing back out. And the county wasn't joking about the fines. So exactly 30 days later, I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying a quiet Saturday morning, when I heard the sound of power tools coming from Rick's yard. I looked over the fence line, and there it was, a demolition crew. 3 guys with pry bars and drills systematically removing every single board Rick had installed just a month earlier. Panels stacked in a pile, posts pulled out of the ground, concrete bases broken apart. Rick stood there supervising, arms crossed, face tight with frustration. No sunglasses this time. No smirk. Just the slow realization that his 2 extra feet of yard had just turned into one very expensive lesson. By the end of the afternoon, the entire fence was gone. The orange survey flags still marked the correct boundary line, and the space between our yards was exactly the way it had been for the last 15 years. Rick never apologized. But interestingly, he also never tried anything like that again. Sometimes the most effective argument isn't yelling. It's simply letting reality and the county government do the talking. And trust me, reality tends to win those conversations every time. So that was the end of the fence situation, at least on paper. The boundary went back to exactly where it had been for 15 years. The oak tree kept casting its shade across the grass, and Rick's little expansion project disappeared like it had never happened. But the interesting part of the story isn't really the fence coming down. It's what the whole situation revealed about how people behave when property, ego, and assumptions collide. Because the truth is, Rick didn't just build a fence. What he really built was a bet that I wouldn't push back. And that kind of bet happens in neighborhoods all across the country. The lesson here is something a lot of homeowners learn the hard way. Boundaries are only real if someone is willing to defend them. Not emotionally, not aggressively, just clearly and consistently. The moment someone realizes you're unwilling to challenge them, that's when small pushes start turning into permanent changes. 2 feet becomes 4. A garden bed becomes a shed. A fence becomes a permanent line. And suddenly what started as a minor misunderstanding becomes a legal nightmare. From a legal perspective, property disputes almost always favor the person who documents everything and acts early. That's the boring answer nobody wants to hear, but it's the one that works. Surveys, deeds, county records, those aren't just paperwork sitting in a drawer. They're the blueprint of ownership. When someone challenges that blueprint, the smartest response isn't anger. It's evidence. And honestly, that's something Rick never seemed to understand, because his whole strategy depended on intimidation and inconvenience. He assumed the cost of fighting him would be greater than the value of 2 feet of land. What he didn't calculate was the opposite possibility, that the cost of being wrong might be far higher. Thousands of dollars in construction, thousands more to remove it, a legal order from the county, and probably a reputation around the neighborhood as the guy who tried to steal part of someone's yard and got slapped down by a surveyor. Now here's the psychological part that fascinates me. This is a psychological trap a lot of people fall into when they start small territorial conflicts. They convince themselves they're already right, so they stop gathering information. They stop asking questions. They start building their case entirely on confidence instead of facts. Rick probably looked at that stretch of grass every day and slowly convinced himself it should belong to him. Maybe he wanted more space for his truck. Maybe he didn't like that my yard looked bigger than his. Maybe it was just pride. Whatever the reason, once that idea settled into his head, the next step was inevitable. Act first, argue later. And that's where things fell apart for him. Because reality doesn't care about confidence. Reality cares about measurements. So now things are quiet again. Rick still lives next door. We don't talk much beyond the occasional polite nod when we're both outside. The yard looks the same as it did before the whole situation started, except now there's something invisible sitting along that property line. Respect. Not friendly respect. More like cautious respect. The kind that comes from someone realizing you're not the easy target they thought you were. And honestly, that's enough for me. But I'm curious what you'd do in the same situation. If you came home one day and found your neighbor building a fence 2 feet inside your yard, would you confront them immediately? Or would you let it go to avoid the headache? Would you have gone straight to the survey like I did? Or try to settle it with a handshake and a conversation? Because situations like this reveal something interesting about human nature. Some people believe peace comes from avoiding conflict. Others believe peace comes from setting boundaries early so conflict never grows bigger later. Personally, after this experience, I leaned strongly toward the second option. Because at the end of the day, the grass in my backyard didn't change. The oak tree didn't move. The property line stayed exactly where it had always been. The only thing that changed was Rick finally understanding where it was.